morning, good afternoon, good evening. Welcome to today's session titled Community Supported Fisheries, Small-Scale Fisheries, Peasant Agriculture, Same Struggle, Similar Solutions. My name is Joshua Stoll, and I'm faculty in the School of Marine Sciences at the University of Maine in the Northeast United States. I've been working with fishing communities around the world for more than a decade to elevate fish as food and the role that seafood plays in local and regional food systems through network building and research. It is a privilege to be on this virtual stage today with our panelists, and I extend my appreciation to Urgency for organizing this session. My role today is simple, to set the context for this session and briefly introduce you to our panel. I hope to then largely step out of the way so that you can hear from each of our panelists as much as possible. Today's session will be 55 minutes. I've asked each panelist to be prepared to respond to several trigger questions to kick off our discussion. The remainder of our time will be then used and then be much more conversational. I invite you to type questions and comments into the chat box during the session, and I will do my best as moderator to incorporate them into the discussion as we go. It's worth noting that the Oxford Real Farming Conference, as the name suggests, is about farming, and this panel is about fishers, seafood, and fishing communities. In other words, it is not about farmers or farms. In the last few decades, important progress has been made to bring focus to solidarity-based terrestrial food systems that connect people to local and regional food systems and those who produce it. For multiple reasons, the focus on fish as food and those who harvest, process, and transport it from boat to fork have not been elevated in the same way, though seafood is a critically important part of human health and well-being, and small-scale fisheries play a particularly important role, representing 90% of the people involved in the sector. Instead, the seafood sector has become progressively more globalized. Today, an estimated 36% of the seafood worldwide is traded across national borders at a value of $148 billion. This represents a 515% increase in the last 3 decades alone. While some point to the benefits of this systematic transformation that has happened in our food system, there are also major social, cultural, economic, and environmental repercussions. It is within this context that we have started to see the emergence and proliferation of community-based and alternative seafood marketing initiatives that focus on relocalizing seafood systems to achieve a range of socioeconomic and environmental outcomes. These exist around the world and take many forms, including a subset of them called community-supported fisheries, the marine-based version of community-supported agriculture. There are numerous parallels between this movement and the agricultural sector, and this session focuses on the overlap. Today, I'm joined by 3 all-star panelists, and I'd like to introduce them now. The first is Irmak Ertuğ, who is a political ecologist at Boğaziçi University in Istanbul, Turkey. Irmak work focuses on environmental justice, agroecology, food sovereignty, and small-scale fishing communities, including community-supported fisheries. As an activist researcher, she supports Istanbul Birlik, an umbrella association of 34 fishing cooperatives in the Istanbul region. Next, we have Brett Tolley. Brett is the National Program Coordinator for the Northwest Atlantic Marine Alliance, a fisher-led organization based in the United States that is building a movement towards healthier fisheries and fishing communities. Brett comes from a 4th-generation fishing family and serves on the International Committee for Urgency. And finally, I'm pleased to introduce Thibaut Joost. Thibaut works for a French-based association called Plan Mayor, a collective of fishers and fish eaters working together for local, equitable, and sustainable fisheries through the development of community-supported fisheries. While his work currently focuses on coastal communities in France, he has also extensive experience working in the global South on issues of social and environmental justice. Thank you all for being here today. Again, thank you to Urgency for organizing this session. To kick off our panel, I would welcome each of you to take a minute to reflect on the biggest challenges you see facing small-scale fishers and the extent to which these challenges are similar or different from the small-scale farming sector. Here, Mark, I was wondering if you could kick off this discussion.
Sure. Thanks a lot for the introduction, Joshua, and thanks a lot to everyone for being here today. Well, I will just bring it part of the story, and so that you can continue with adding some more points. And actually, you would what one would think of or like hear usually about the main challenges is the overfishing and like the falling fish stocks, no? But this is only part of the story. And well, what we have to focus on at the same time is like that the loss of access to fishing grounds, traditional fishing grounds of small-scale fishers, which is also linked to further investment projects on the ground that are placed usually on the coastlines. They can be energy projects, urbanization, infrastructure, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, the increasing corporate control over seafood production, and also especially also on fishing grounds, both of which, of course, lead to in many cases lead to displacement of small-scale fisher people. It can be like fishing cooperatives or fisher communities, and well, and especially to the phenomena that we call ocean grabbing, which can be also done by state actors or private actors. So it leads also main challenges of problems in access to local markets, access to value for food, and so on and so forth. But I guess for now, so that I can keep it short, I will stop here and then give the floor to you.
Brett, I'd love to hear your reflections on this link between, well, the challenges for small-scale fishers as well as the link between small-scale fishers and farmers. You're on mute. While Brett is working on unmuting himself, Thibaut, do you want to chime in on this question?
Sure, I can. Well, basically for me, I would say that the biggest issue I see in the life of fishers every day is mostly the price, the fish price. Because in France, there is a particular system when you come back from the sea. Well, first you go to the sea, you don't know if you're going to catch fish or not. But then when you come back, you don't know actually the price for which you're going to sell this fish, just because there is actually a fish auction, and it's like a decreasing auction. So the price starts, let's say, at 6 per kilo, and it's going to decrease until someone says that he buys the fish. So this is for us a quite problematic issue, that there is no fixed price for fishers when they come back from their fishing activities. And that's why we see community-supported fisheries as a solution to this issue. Thank you.
Well, I think that's a nice segue into this question of community-supported fisheries and what they are. So we're at a farming conference. I think many people are likely familiar with what a CSA or community-supported agriculture is. I'm wondering if either you two could weigh in on what is a CSF in the context of fisheries.
Thibaut, go ahead first.
If I would define a CSF in a really simple way, I would say that it's a contract, actually. Contract between the consumer and the small-scale fisher, because the consumers is engaged. I mean, I'm not sure if in English is the right word, but is committed to buy fish directly to the fisher at a fair price, and in exchange, the fisher is committed to use sustainable fishing practices in order to struggle against overfishing. So yeah, for me, it's this contract that I just described that will define community-supported fisheries.
Thank you. Mark, go ahead.
Maybe I jump in now. Well, also based on Turkish experience and some from Spain, I can say. Well, there are already existing direct sale mechanisms, by many fishing cooperatives, but some of them are they also have some networks with consumers where they can have some part of support, but some of them are not very established ways and established mechanisms. So in some cases, in some regions, it still needs some kind of a support and some kind of a proper discussion of what it would mean being a more established and strengthened community-supported fisheries network. So in Turkey, there are several direct sale mechanisms, but we couldn't consider all of them as community-supported fisheries, because in addition to what Thibaut mentioned, I would also say the part of understanding the challenges of each other, understanding the challenges, understanding the ways in which they operate, and at the same time sharing the culture, learning more, getting more awareness of the difficulties, and finding out together solutions to how our food system, how our localized food system focusing on seafood production would take shape. So it would also kind of it includes further learning processes for both consumers and producers, and learning the needs and trying to support each other.
Yeah, thank you. Because Brett had to hop off because of technical difficulties, I might also add, take off my facilitator and moderator hat and just add some context from the US and North America. We have, in the last 10 years, seen the rise and proliferation of community-supported fisheries in a pretty big way. And in many ways, they have roots in the agricultural sector. So they're poaching the concepts and the idea and the structure of CSAs and applying them to CSFs and to fisheries. And that has been quite interesting to see, in that in some ways there's a nice direct correlation, a one-to-one correlation. In some ways there's differences, right? Farmers can own land and they have their physical space, where many fishers in the US, that is not the case. They're participating in common pool resources, where they go out to the ocean and are participating. So I think that creates some really interesting parallels and challenges as well. One of the questions that I wanted to ask, we were starting to see community-supported fisheries sprout up around the world, and I'm interested to hear from both of you about building and strengthening CSFs in your respective places, but also building and strengthening the movement around the world, and what will be involved in doing that. I'd very much be interested in your take on that.
Maybe I will let Irma go first.
Okay, cool. Thank you very much. Well, just to say first, that we see, maybe I should refer actually to a recent report that we have published. This is a TNI report. Thibaut is one of the co-authors, Zoe Brandt and David Gaillard are the others. And there we had to understand the link between and the convergences between different kind of small-scale producers and their struggles. So it was trying to situate small-scale fisheries in the global struggle for agroecology and food sovereignty, and trying to understand what kind of differences there are. Of course, there is like kind of a high variety of different practices, different mechanisms of fishing, different gears and different cultures, as opposed to different agroecological practices on the ground on the land. But at the same time, whenever we talk about like the struggles for a just food system and for what kind of a food system we want, especially around the discussions on food sovereignty, we could see also like, even though there are sometimes different terms, different terminologies are used, we could see that they were converging around several aspects. We can see like the territorialization of food production. We can see around also one important aspect that we have discussed was regarding gender and how like the feminist aspect of food sovereignty struggles and debates as well. And at the same time, labor in the fisheries sector, which has both its challenges, and we have to understand it well. Thibaut was also contributing in that part. So we can, in the struggles for food and for just food systems and for food sovereignty, we could see lots of convergences, and where fisher people already have been coming together with peasants, with beekeepers, with pastoralists, and so on and so forth. So we have already many examples of joining the forces and like solidarity examples between different actors. They already see part, especially the global movements, already see themselves part of a broader global movement, social movement. But of course, like we have to understand very well as well where they converge and what are like the specific challenges that fisher communities face.
Thibaut, do you have anything else to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I would add that in terms of political goals, CSA and CSF are actually pretty similar, and which I mean is really related to what Irmak just said in terms of also common struggles. In logistical terms, however, I guess that's where the biggest difference lie, in terms of like all the value chain and all the logistics needed, particularly for fish conservation. But yeah, regarding like common struggle, I couldn't agree more on what was said by Irmak, basically.
Thanks, Thibaut. And I just want to acknowledge Brett. Welcome back. I hope your sound is with you now. We have been talking about building networks and developing community-supported fisheries around the world. And one of the things that Thibaut just mentioned is this importance of values. And I know you've missed some of the conversation, but you've invested a lot of time and energy in helping to build a set of core values for community-supported fisheries in North America. I was wondering if you could speak to that a little bit, and we can use this as an opportunity to test your sound as well.
Yep, you got me. Test 1, 2. Thanks, everybody. Thanks. Sorry for the technical difficulties. Pleasure to be here. So the values are everything for us and the work that we're doing to build out these alternative models. And for us, in the context of the United States, it all really began by looking at our family farm models and the movement to support family farmers, and what was working was recognized and used to inspire fishing communities that were struggling for all the reasons that Irmak and Thibaut had mentioned before. We're seeing ocean grabs, we're similar to land grabs. We're seeing the forces of industrial kind of food pressure our small and medium scale fishing communities to the extent where they have to look at these alternative models. So, you know, in the States, we knew that community-supported agriculture was growing, and opportunities at places like farmers markets and other institutions. And so we basically tried to steal all the good ideas from our family farmers and apply them to the family fishing. And one of those, in looking, you know, at specifically the model of community-supported agriculture and fisheries, what we learned was that really focusing a little bit less on the actual model itself and rather focus more on a suite of values was the key to really advance this bigger like systems change that we've been moving towards. So Local Catch really ran with that sort of insight or that advice, and we spent the better part of about 2 years as a network trying to discuss what are the core values, what are the things that really separate us from this more global industrial scale food model that we know is wreaking havoc on our ocean and our communities and our local economies. And the outcome of that process was a suite of about 10 core values. We're pretty proud of them. They're not perfect, but they kind of capture the essence of what we're trying to build, and they touch upon economic values and social values and environmental values, all really centering around the people who are really on the front lines of the fishing activities and the fishing businesses. So I really encourage folks, I think we can share in the chat a link to those Local Catch core values and really encourage folks to take a deeper look at those. But yeah, the values are everything, and it's a continuing process, right? We don't see it's not a static document. It's something we continue to grow and evolve as we go and deepen those values and the commitment to those values.
Thanks, Brett. I hope at some point during this conversation you can describe a little bit more what the Local Catch Network is. But I want to piggyback off of this question about values. We're starting to get some questions from the audience that I think we can connect to this conversation about what are the objectives of community-supported fisheries. There's these interesting set of questions around, as many people know, in aquaculture, some forms of aquaculture require using fish meal to feed fish, and so there's this question of sort of environmental impacts from fishing and aquaculture. We also have this other question about the role that community-supported fisheries play in restoring wetlands and estuaries, and I would broaden that out to the environment. And so I'm curious, from your perspectives, working with fishing communities on the ground in Turkey and in France and in the US and Canada, how can small-scale fishers, what role do they play as stewards for the environment? And I'd open that up to any of you.
Maybe I can jump in, if it's fine. Well, it's a tricky question, I would say, because I mean the last question is restoring the critical wetland and estuaries that are essential for the population of certain species. I do think fishers play a critical role in terms of the preservation of the resource, and in the meantime, we should not forget that fishing is actually taking resource from the sea in order to eat it. So there will always be kind of negative impacts of fishers on the environmental, on the ecosystem, basically. That's the definition of fishing. But I would say that I'm not sure if CSF can help restoring wetlands and estuaries, but I do see that when fishers are involved in CSF, they get to sell their fish for way better price. And I mean, nobody wants to spend his life only at sea. They have families, they want to be with their families, have a social life. So when they see that they can get more money if they give a better valorization to their fish, they actually go less at sea, which has a direct effect on the ecosystem and the resource. And it can be like high percentages. Some fishers go 30% less at sea when they sell their fish directly to consumers. So they actually see it, and you can definitely feel it in the ecosystem on the long term, even if we should not forget that it's only for some fishers, but there will always, I mean, there is still industrial fishing, which sometimes affects similar stocks and population than small-scale fishers, than the one exploited by small-scale fishers. So actually you can, if you do CSF without struggling against the parts of the industry that impact ecosystems critically, you might also lose a battle in terms of preserving the environment. Thank you.
Mac, would you like to go? I can follow.
Go ahead, Brett.
Okay. Yeah, great question. I kind of think in two parts. The first part is that for most small and medium scale like fishing folks around the United States and the North America region, there's no incentive with the globalized kind of global fish market that Irmak and Josh described at the beginning. There's no real incentive to be strong stewards or to do restoration work. The only incentive is really catch high volume and get really low value, low price for it, as Thibaut had mentioned before. So we're forcing this. The system has forced what I would say is very conservation-minded people to go high volume, low value, or get out, basically. And what CSFs and similar models are doing are giving another way, another option. And this is two ways that we're seeing it show up in the United States. One is that for groups of fishermen or fishermen themselves who actually want to do, try out a new gear type because they know it reduces their bycatch, or do like restoration work, give a break to a space in the ocean that needs it, that the model that is connecting directly to their local communities and their region is actually attracting people. People want to be connected to these businesses because of these conservation efforts. So that's one very big positive. And then the other one is that we're seeing a lot of these models reconnect communities and regions to the seasons of their fish, right? That's another element of what the global food system has done, similar to on land, is just completely disconnected people to the seasons of the food, and in this case, like the rhythms of the marine ecosystem and the ocean. The global system demands the same species 365 days every year, constantly, and that's just not how the ocean and marine ecosystems work. And so CSFs have been an educational tool, a reconnection tool, so that people are actually knowing what is being caught locally and regionally. How can they, instead of demanding farm salmon, constantly, how can they learn about other species that are actually swimming in their waters not too far away, and get reintroduced and reminded about how to cook with them and new ingredients. And we're seeing community-supported fisheries and similar models really play that role, which ultimately has major conservation outcomes.
Here, Mark, it looked like you had some additional feedback.
Okay, sure. Well, I would also like to jump in because there are some questions, as far as I see, regarding the question linked to the aquaculture. And when we talk about the aquaculture, it's like intensive aquaculture. And well, both globally and focusing on Turkey, I would like to first distinguish, like, for those of you who are not that familiar with the issue, like whenever we talk about fisheries, and here we are mostly talking about small-scale fisheries, we have to distinguish between small-scale fisheries and industrial fisheries, and at the same time between aquaculture. But when we say aquaculture, there are also two types: extensive aquaculture and intensive aquaculture. The most industrialized version is the intensive aquaculture, as we know, like these fish farms which require input the fish feeds, sometimes antibiotics or chemicals as well, and then you harvest the same species from the encircled marine area whenever we talk about marine intensive aquaculture. So regarding small-scale fisheries and their role and value for food, linked to value for food and so on, in focusing on Turkish experience, aquaculture has grown a lot. Marine intensive aquaculture has grown a lot in the last 2 decades, let's say, in Turkey. It is mainly based on sea bass and sea bream as species, but at the same time, it has been growing in a way. Of course, I mean, since it is intensive, in one of the studies that we made, actually, we could see how the use of fish feed, actually, how the industrial intensive aquaculture production depends on small pelagic fish, which comes again from the industrial fisheries, industrial captures. So we could see its link, and by focusing on a Turkish case, we could see its link with the destruction of especially anchovies and spread stocks. So, but small-scale fishers and their role, they actually, in some regions in Turkey, they are not coming into conflict with aquaculture and with fish farms, since there are not many in their regions. But in others, of course, they are either displaced or they lose the access to their fishing grounds. And at the same time, of course, it has another impact on like industrial fisheries, together with the promotion of industrial, with the need of fish feed by the industrial aquaculture. So it is another pressure, it is another threat put on the stocks. So it is for them, for small-scale fishers, it's also again another industrial project which actually leaves them, and which leads to ocean grabbing in some cases, or which leads to their displacement whenever there are some fish farm allocated zones for fish farms, and so on and so forth. So maybe we should say, to explain a little bit better to the understanding between these industrial versions of seafood production and small-scale fishers' relation with seafood and marine spaces. Well, the head of Istanbul Birlik once mentioned in one of our interviews that he was seeing fish not as a commodity but as food. Of course, they also make their livelihood out of this, and of course they also eat it. But that was his discourse, which actually, for me, it was like clear that he has been talking about another way of relations with the seas and with the oceans. And they are much more able to see the changes in the seas, and it is very important for them, because they cannot just get rid of this sector and go to another sector in order to make more profits, but they depend on this resource, they depend on this relation in a way. So they are caring much more in the Istanbul region, especially, I can say, with the umbrella organization Istanbul Birlik, they care much more of how it would be further sustainable, how they could be being in a relationship which would sustain for more further generations in a way.
Thank you. I think this conversation about the link between small-scale fisheries, community-supported fisheries, and conservation is an important thread. And clearly, based on the questions that we're getting from the audience, there's interest in hearing more about this. So I'm wondering if there are any specific examples that anyone on the panel can provide where groups of fishers are coming together through community-supported fisheries or collective action to address issues of conservation, to either safeguard stocks or to deal with destructive practices or to improve the way that they're operating within the marine context. And Thibaut, I think your point is well taken. Any extractive activity, fishing is one of those. There are environmental consequences, but we are also seeing some important acts of conservation and stewardship among this community, this broader community. So I'm wondering if anyone could provide some examples. And it looked like Thibaut, you were about to jump in, so I'll turn the floor to you.
Why not? I was being a bit provocative, saying that small-scale fish are impacting the environment, because I think it's important to keep in mind, particularly when the role of community-supported fisheries is actually to reduce this impact, then it means that there is an impact at the beginning. But it's funny that you asked this question, because we are currently working on a new project that just got some funding. There was a fisher from Normandy. He lives in Ouistreham. His name is Philip. And it's like a year that he's like basically harassing me, telling me we need to build a project on depollution by the fishers. Every time there is plastic in our nets, in our trawls, in our lines, whatever, some fisher put it back in the sea. I want to take it back to the harbor, but there are no facilities to recycle and stuff. And I was like, yeah, I mean, I have a lot of work to do, obviously. So at the beginning, I was just like, okay, maybe we're going to do this project. Let's see. But finally, he insisted so much that we actually developed a whole frame about this project, tried to contact donors. It was not working so well with the donors at the beginning. And then months ago, we got a call, and it actually got partly funded, at least. So we're going to begin in Ouistreham in the next few weeks. It's actually, the founder is actually another organization working in Spain with small-scale fisher on the Mediterranean coast of Spain. And they are trawlers, but I mean, I don't know if some of you ever went on board on a trawler, but you actually got a lot of shit in the trawl, like plastic, whatever, like really random stuff. And I think it would be great if this can be recycled, and that's what actually they do on the Mediterranean coast of Spain. They're actually recycling it into clothes, whatever things they can do. So it's pretty interesting. And all of that to say that it's not really about like community supported fisheries. There is no question of food right now, but actually in this project we're going to do in France, obviously we know that the fishers we work with on CSF issues are going to be relevant in order to develop this project, because they already have this whole mentality of how can we struggle against overfishing, how can we develop sustainable fisheries production. So if we talk to them about this new project of recycling all the trash that they find in the nets, they're definitely going to be motivated. And I mean, thanks to the work we do on community supported fisheries, basically. So yeah, that was my answer to this question.
Thank you. Earmarker. Brett, would either of you like to weigh in?
Okay, I can go. Yeah, one concrete story of fishers working together to conserve a fish stock comes from Port Clyde, Maine. One of the first community-supported fishery programs in the United States started around 2008. Port Clyde Fresh Catch is the name of the group. And at the time, shrimp, northern shrimp, was a really important fishery, and the stocks were not doing so great. And the fishermen were getting paid about 30 cents a pound to the boat, which is pretty low. And as I described before, it was forcing the fishers to catch high volume. The only way to make it worth it, to make it economically sustainable, was to catch a lot of the shrimp. And the fishermen knew that if everybody caught a lot just to sustain themselves, it was going to plummet the stock. So they had to do something different. And so they began this model that could connect more directly to their community, to their region, take some control back over the process of moving their fish, which ultimately resulted in a more fair price. By the end of the year, they were able to get $1 a pound for the shrimp, and then reduce the pressure off of that stock that they were taking. So they really achieved their goal of taking it more easy, catching less volume, but getting a more fair price. So that was a big victory. And then there's another example of a community-supported fishery called Walking Fish in North Carolina. It has a sort of co-op model, and the co-op members every year pool a percentage of their money into a kind of a conservation fund. And they invest that money into either a gear technology that might help reduce the impact to the ocean, or a lot of other different types of conservation efforts. So there are lots of really great ideas that are emerging on all the different coasts around here.
Earmark, please.
Thank you. Maybe I can mention the example of that comes from 2009. The example of the efforts to protect Bluefish, which is a bluefish species, very specific to the Bosphorus Strait and Marmara Sea. It is delicious, I have to admit, and it is a very culturally, and traditionally, historically, it is also a very important species as well, which is a high value, and it is very much associated with all of the stories and narratives of the region. And actually, some of you people would know, like the head of the Istanbul Birlik would always try to bring us to eat some bluefish so that we can taste it, so that we can understand and share this culture. So around 2009, there was a big campaign to protect this bluefish, where actually the fishing cooperatives, the small-scale fishing cooperatives, approached mostly 1-2 NGOs and some universities at the same time in order to understand how the stock looks like current at that point, and what they could do, because there was an important fall at that moment. And well, actually the same juveniles of the same fish was being used a lot, was being sold a lot, and especially they were caught by industrial fishers. And since it was very important for all of these fisher people, they were trying to establish more contacts and establish more solidarity networks. And there were important campaigns which also focused on the markets which are dominated by the intermediaries, where the same fishing cooperatives cannot have their own stand, but actually it is based on, it is controlled by the intermediaries, which pay like really a very low price to the fishers themselves, and then at several stages they make a lot of profit out of that. And they also collaborated with some of the restaurants, with some of the chefs, with the consumers. And even though there was not an exact case of community-supported fisheries, this case actually empowered the small-scale fishing cooperatives, and there was much more awareness in the civil society, because like many people were not knowing like where the fish comes from. It is not that transparent actually in general in Turkey, but also in Istanbul. So it kind of empowered these cooperatives so that they can continue with other struggles as well. I cannot tell the same story, the same success story in terms of the protection of the stock, because it is still very threatened. But it has empowered it has strengthened this relation between consumers, urban social actors, NGOs, universities, and fishing cooperatives. And actually there they could begin to have kind of a higher voice in the national fisheries policies as well.
I think we could have a long conversation about this interplay between conservation and community-based fishing efforts. I want to move us to a few of the other questions that we've received from the audience that I think are really important. And I'm going to try to bundle a couple questions about indigenous communities and also global south. So we have one question around the relevance of community-supported fisheries to the global south, and then another question around how indigenous communities interplay with wetlands, but I would also extend that out to marine fisheries. And just wondering if any of you have thoughts or comments on the relevance of CSFs as a global phenomenon, and not just sort of a quote unquote middle class or high income phenomenon. And feel free to chime in. I don't need to call on you specifically.
Just to jump in very briefly, also based on our report, perhaps, what I can say is, in the global south, these markets have been already established, and some of them are destroyed by several urban grabbing and displacement mechanisms. But actually, especially in rural places, these mechanisms of shorter distances of production and consumption, as well as like more further support between consumers and producers, is much more there, because it is much more kind of a community issue. There are lots of fishery initiatives from the global south who try to organize themselves, who get together with other social actors and try to be part of the global food sovereignty movement. What I can say there is like maybe they don't use, or like maybe it is not the context exactly what we would say a community supported fisheries network in an urban context, and what we could say in a rural context. And in many cases, in many communities, rural communities in the global south, actually fishers are also peasants, or like the same community is engaged with different activities of primary sector and food production, small scale food production. So there is not a real distinction in that way, I would say.
Yeah, just to build off of that a little bit, I think here in the United States, in our context, I think when it comes to indigenous cultures and indigenous fishing communities, the models that were developed a long time ago inherently embodied the values that we're all talking about, values around deep conservation, connecting to feed people well, honor the fish, honor the ocean. All of these things have been there for time immemorial. And it's really the models that the colonists brought that have arrived, brought us to where we are today, where we've severed so many of those values in the current system. And the severing began with those indigenous models. And so for non-indigenous folks, we're kind of recognizing these problems that have been growing for a couple of centuries and building models and calling it community supported fisheries. But ultimately, these are the models that were being threatened hundreds of years ago here in indigenous communities. And so for the local catch network, I think we've recognized kind of this internally, how important it is to identify where some of the problems that we're talking about began, and looking at those who have been leading on solutions for a long time. And we've been having those kind of conversations between indigenous and non-indigenous people here in the North America region, and beginning slow, exchanging, educating ourselves as we go, because it touches on some very deep conflicts and tensions. But no doubt there's absolutely, I think I would say like thriving in some cases, indigenous fishing communities here on the East Coast, on the West Coast, that are still there and fighting to honor some of the treaties that were signed that provide their fishing rights. Yeah, so just wanted to lift that up. One group in particular that we actually highlighted at our last local catch seafood summit was a group from the Nisqually tribe called Shinanam. Shinanam Seafood is really doing amazing work with their models and syncing up other indigenous fishing communities on the West Coast here in the States.
Go ahead, Pico.
Yeah, I was not sure if Brett was done or not, but I guess he is. Well, the question was actually, are CSF relevant to the Global South? It sounded quite funny to me because it would be a bit like asking, is food relevant to the Global South? I guess it is. And also, I mean, for me, when I work on CSF in France, I actually take as a model what I saw in the Global South, because we basically, like, naturally there is community supported fisheries in fishing communities, but we actually destroyed it in the Global North with like industrial food, big transformation, industrial fishing and shit. But when you think about it, when you go in a community in Indonesia, in South Africa, there is fishing communities, which we don't have anymore for me. We don't have any more fishing communities in the Global North, and we try in a like intellectual way and political way to rebuild it, which we call community supported fisheries. But actually, when I go in a fishing harbor in France, you don't feel a fishing community as much as you would feel if you go, for example, to Indonesia. So I would say that you have much more community supported fisheries in the Global South, and they need to be supported as well in different ways, but it's much more like natural. Even the term community supported fisheries is maybe less used, just because that's what has been happening. And you have the people going at sea, you have the people transforming the fish, everything is done on the street, everyone can see it, it smells like fish. So you really have this whole like fishing community basically. So yeah, it's definitely relevant in the Global South, because I would say that it's what I use as a model in order to work in the Global North,
Thanks, Thibaut. I think that's a really important point. I want to be conscious of time here, and we're already coming up on our 55 minutes. There are some really important questions that have been asked, and we certainly won't be able to get to all of them. But I'd like to give each of you sort of a last word, and I'd like to frame this around a couple of the questions we've received, as well as one that I had for all of you. And this is around this question of global ocean governance, and what role do we see global ocean governance? I'm thinking, for example, about things like the FAO's voluntary guidelines for small-scale fisheries. What role does this global governance play in enabling or disabling community-supported fisheries? And then, Earmark, for you, in addition to sort of responding to that question, there is some work in the EU right now around building a network of community-supported fisheries that's being led by Urgency. I was wondering if you could also share a little bit about that and how people on this call who might be interested in engaging could connect with the work. So last words for everyone, and I really appreciate your time and energy and the work that you're doing to elevate fish as food.
Well, maybe I might begin and then go to the second question at the end after the other speakers also participate. In terms of global ocean governance, I have to say that like maybe since the 1950s, the global ocean governance has been favoring and prioritizing industrial fisheries. No? So here there is a need to, again, like confront these policies and like try to reverse them, try to re-establish them. And where there is a further need of solidarity and collaboration among different social actors of agroecology and food sovereignty, I would say, which also incorporates community-supported agriculture and community-supported fisheries actors. So I think there is a need of further, first having a better awareness of what is happening on the seas and oceans, because like with all of these blue growth discourses and political strategies, actually this threat is being further accelerated. And so I would say that like for a new and just global ocean governance, we need to confront these discourses. And well, what we would perhaps propose is more solidarity and collaboration between different social actors of food sovereignty.
Okay, I can build off of that. And thanks again, everybody. Thanks, Josh, for facilitating. Appreciate everybody being here. Just to build off of what Irmak had said, I think the centering point for the future of global ocean governance is the United Nations voluntary guidelines for sustaining small-scale fisheries. If we can't sustain small-scale fisheries on the global level, then we'll never have these types of models that we're talking about. And to really acknowledge that process at the United Nations level has been really led by the World Forum of Fisher Peoples. That from our perspective is like the organizing and political space, primarily driven by fishers in the global south, that's really like pushing the vision and the values at the global level. And Irmak also mentioned food sovereignty. The food sovereignty discussions also happening at the United Nations, also being led in many ways by food sovereignty groups like La Via Campesina, are really starting to collaborate and connect and coordinate with the World Forum of Fisher Peoples. So this is really exciting sort of like global power that's being built between those groups in particular. Urgency that Irmak is going to mention a little bit more is also part of that larger effort toward food sovereignty. So with that said, there's certainly the role that we're trying to play here in the United States, and like Tipo said, like taking those good lessons learned and being in solidarity with fishing communities all over. And just two things to mention as my final parting words. Just wanted to highlight the Local Catch Network again. I know I mentioned it a few times, but localcatch.org is the website. That's sort of the, it's been around for about a decade. It's our centering kind of movement hub for these alternative models, connecting small and medium scale fishermen and just people who care, academics and other activists and food folks and farming folks, all coming together around this local catch. We're really excited. A lot of things.
Thank you, Brett. We're losing you here. I'm going to turn to Thibaut for the last word.
Well, you might be disappointed of my last word, actually, because I'm not so familiar with the small-scale fisheries guidelines in my everyday work. I guess all the energy, money, and that has been put in it is pretty useful in terms of organizing people on the ground, which is mostly my preoccupation. And I guess the question now is, how are these guidelines useful for small-scale fishers in order for them to build community-supported fisheries or other structures in general? But I would say that struggle convergence in general with La Via Campesina, WFFP, and all these movements are definitely useful as soon as they are like really linked and related to the priorities of the grounds, which means the fishers, basically. Thank you so much.
Maybe finally, I will also try to respond to your second question, Josh. Well, I think the link has been already shared. Well, there is the new project of urgency, Back to Dish, of which we all form part of, actually, all the speakers and the moderator. And well, in order to expand these experiences and like try to establish more stronger networks in a way. Of course, there is the necessity of bringing different urban social actors also into this, so that we can increase the awareness and so on. But like this project tries to both map such initiatives to understand them, and like of course one needs to collaborate on the ground as well, so that politically and practically there are more stronger networks, and like and facilitating also fisher-to-fisher learning and fisher-to-fisher experiences, which are usually really appreciated by the small-scale fisher people, at least in Turkey. So bringing in different actors, also like including municipalities, including like better ways of local food production and consumption networks. But the project tries is actually to try to expand these understanding and experiences, understand them better, and like continue to collaborate with the small scale fishers on the ground and establish these networks and bring together these CSA and CSF networks, let's say.
Thank you so much, and thank you to all the panelists and the organizers of the Oxford Real Farm conference. We appreciate this opportunity and hope this session has made folks think about the connection between fishing and farming in a new way. We invite you all to stay connected with us. I think our contact information has been shared at some point, and thank you for the opportunity.